G'day, I am Derek Fildebrandt, publisher of the Western Standard. You're watching The Pipeline. Joining me today is Cory Morgan, podcast editor and columnist extraordinaire. How you doing, Cory?
Good.
Dave Naylor, news editor of the Western Standard, joining us today from Vancouver, British Columbia. G'day, Dave.
G'day. I just want to make it clear that the background is a bit of a fraud. It is not nice out here on the wet coast. It's gloomy and rainy, but yeah, good to be with you guys.
And you're not 3 kilometers in the air.
No, exactly not. I'm not in a special hot air balloon.
Yeah. And joining us, our new Ottawa bureau chief, joining us from close to Parliament Hill, on the Quebec side of the river, is Ken Grafton. Welcome to the team, Ken.
Just downwind from Parliament Hill, Derek. Thanks so much. Good to be here.
Downwind, that makes good sense. Well, thank you very much for joining us here today. We're pleased to have you. Remember, if you're a Western Standard member, we thank you very much for your support. If you're not yet a member, please go to westernstandardonline.com, click on membership, and support the work we're doing to support bailout-free, genuinely independent media for Western Canada. Okay, well, we're going to get straight into it. Today, we're going to be covering, if a carbon tax gets increased by 570% and no one hears it, did the carbon tax get increased? Yes, it did. You're still going to pay for it, but the media are ignoring it. So we're going to talk about first, the economics and political impact of the 570% increase in the carbon tax and why the hell the mainstream media is utterly ignoring this. We're going to be talking about an extraordinary open letter written by Dr. Denis Modry, one of the most renowned and experienced and qualified doctors in Alberta, who has written an open letter to Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, taking him to task for the lockdowns and mask mandates. This letter's had an extraordinary impact. We're going to talk about that. As well, we'll talk about Calgary and Edmonton, who have extended their mandatory mask mandates for an entire year. Yes, you heard that. Calgary and Edmonton bylaws require that you're going to wear a mask almost anywhere you go outside your home until December 2021. Well, I don't even know what we can say about that. That's some wild stuff, but we're going to take it on. So we're going to start with the 570% carbon tax increase. The federal Liberal government announced this when Justin Trudeau was making an address to the UN's Paris Climate Accord. They were having a bit of an online powwow. Finally, they figured that if you're going to talk about global warming, maybe you shouldn't fly thousands of people around the world to get together for hors d'oeuvres. So they finally had one of these climate confabs online. They finally figured out Zoom is appropriate for these things if you're trying to save the planet. And in Justin Trudeau's statement, he just kind of slipped in there, oh yeah, and I'm increasing the price, they call it price on carbon, they don't call it carbon taxes. The price on carbon to, I think, $270 per metric ton, if I'm not mistaken. That works out to a 570% increase from where it currently is. It was already scheduled to get to $50 a ton. Justin Trudeau and then Environment Minister Catherine McKenna swore to the gods. They put their hand on, what would a lefty swear on? Not the Bible. They put their hands on the manifesto and swore that the carbon tax would never increase beyond $50 a ton. And without consulting Parliament, or anybody, let alone Canadians, they increased the carbon tax to 570%. Now, there is a lot going on in the media. There's a lot to chase. So it's not like there was nothing else to talk about. But the media have been utterly devoid of any kind of comment on this. There's been a few tiny little spots. Brian Lilley had a spot in the Sun paper chain calling out most of his colleagues, I think quite rightly, on this. But in press conferences that Trudeau's been at, the media don't ask a single question about it. It's as if nothing has happened. So I'd like to we're going to get some more information from our Ottawa bureau chief, Ken Grafton. Ken, why don't you tell us about how this was announced, and really how is the rest of the media outside of the Western Standard and the odd little bright light out there like Brian Lilley at the Sun? What do you think explains the complete silence for most of the media around one of the largest single tax increases in Canadian history?
I guess there's a few factors that I see, Derek. One of them, of course, is liberal bias in media, which is generally acknowledged now. Globally, the United States and Canada, 80% figure that I've read for liberal bias in media, print, and other online news media. I think that's part of it, which is not wanting to really criticize the government. There are certain topics you can take on and criticize the government, but there are others you can't. This one has been covered somewhat in Ottawa, but not as much as you would expect, given the import of this topic and the price that Canadians are going to have to pay for it. Obviously, the way Prime Minister Trudeau introduced this was in connection with the UN summit that occurred just recently, and that received very little advance notice. I found out about it 2 days after the fact through a piece in CBC, but basically the line that our Prime Minister has taken is in line with the UN Agenda 2030, and that's climate change and what amounts to a wealth distribution globally, an improvement of conditions for developing countries and a host of other people. The problem with the carbon tax, of course, is the magnet. Our economy is in ruins as a result of liberal spending during COVID and the response to COVID in Canada and other countries. So, a lot of people are looking at this and wondering how they're going to pay an extra, I think it's 37 cents a gallon on gasoline, for example. So, I think that the reason it's not being reported more than it is it's an unpopular topic, and most of the mainstream news in Canada is not inclined to do that.
Thanks, Ken. Cory, maybe you can add to that. Do you think the reason they're essentially ignoring this is because primarily just that most of the media believe that if we don't increase the price of driving your car and heating your home and whatnot, that the world will end? Is essentially that most of the journalists out there for the mainstream media agree with the government, but they know that by and large, at least a large segment of Canadians will be angered by this, and is that why they're not talking about it, or what do you think explains it?
I think they might think that a large segment of Canadians aren't interested in it. This comes back to an East-West issue, because this is going to disproportionately slap down the West, because it really hits agricultural producers and it really hits conventional energy producers. So, I mean, it will catch your average citizen, as was recently mentioned. It's going to catch at the pump with up to 40 cents a liter on your fuel. I was looking at a receipt that a farmer had tweeted from Saskatchewan, because again, people in the East don't understand a lot of this. I mean, it's a different business to them, large-scale farming, and it was for their irrigation. It takes a lot. Moving water is very expensive. It's heavy. It doesn't compress. It's difficult. So the electric bill was massive. This farm collective, with a number of farmers together on it getting irrigation, were paying $18,000 a month in carbon tax bills, just carbon tax, and that's at the $30 a ton. And they pay GST on top of that, so a tax on a tax. And that's going to go up now to $84,000 and change for that farm collective. Plus, people say, oh, farmers are exempt. Well, not on that end. And they're exempt with gasoline, but not with diesel, which is most of what they use. And then it goes on trains, which have to pay the fuel as well. Like, this is going to shoot the cost of food up into the air. I mean, a carbon tax is a tax on everything. The people would better understand it, but I don't think people are. And I think some of the Eastern media might think it's just not worth noting at this time, but it sure will when it comes to their pocketbook.
Dave, I think Cory's got a point. There might be a bit of an East-West divide here. There are many in the East that oppose the carbon tax, and the East is not a monolith. I mean, rural Ontario is pretty radically different from Toronto. Rural Ontario, I've said before, has got more in common culturally and politically with Alberta than it does with Toronto. It doesn't have that regional dynamic, but in many respects, it shares a lot of the same values. But the East, there is still an East-West divide in the aggregate, at least. Dave, do you think that the mainstream media, because this is a federal issue, and the vast majority of the mainstream media is owned and mostly operated out of central eastern Canada. Do you think that is the reason that they're by and large ignoring this? Is it ideological, or is it just that because voters in the East are more willing to accept this kind of tax increase than they are in the West, and because these reporters are in and of the East, that's why they're accepting it?
Well, I think Cory hit the nail on the head in that nobody's been hit in the pocketbook yet by the current carbon tax. Sure, you may have to pay a few pennies on a liter of gasoline, but it's not a huge deal for most people at the moment. Agriculture people are the exception, of course. But and everybody says, all the polls show that people want climate change and action for it. But again, while it's not hitting them in the pocketbook. So while it's costing them a few extra bucks to fill up their car, people are thinking that they're doing their bit to save Mother Earth. But when it goes up 570%, and you're now filling your car is going to cost you 20 or 30 bucks more, then we're going to see whether or not people still want to make that sort of sacrifice for climate change, and it may fall down their priority list a bit lower as the economy goes in the toilet.
Fair enough. Did you have anything to add before we move on?
Is that to me, Derek?
You're Ken.
Yeah, I didn't hear the first part. Yeah, I think I agree with what Dave and Cory said. I think another factor in the coverage of this is the overwhelming preponderance of COVID-19 coverage in the media this year has really taken a lot of bandwidth out of other topics being covered by the media, and that's certainly still the case here. So if you're not talking about COVID-19, you're not getting as many column inches. That's a factor as well, I think.
Fair enough. All right, well, we're going to switch gears, bring it a little closer to home here in the West. Friday evening, we posted an open letter from a Dr. Denis Modry. Dr. Denis Modry performed Alberta's first heart transplant. I think that was back in the 80s. He's got more letters after his name than most people have in their first and last names combined. He is a pretty eminently qualified surgeon and doctor in Alberta. And he's a longtime acquaintance of Jason Kenney, but he published an open letter on the Western Standard that has completely broken the internet. This is already, even though it's only a few days old, it is our most read story of all time. It beats some very other big stories that we've broken on the Western Standard, but this is already the number one. It's just gone absolutely viral around social media, and it's had an impact. Dave, why don't you tell us a bit about the contents of the doctor's letter and what has been the political response to it?
Derek, I remember as a young reporter way back in 1985 when Dr. Modry performed the first heart transplant surgery in Alberta at the University of Alberta, and I remember being so excited and what a breakthrough this was. And he is truly one of Alberta's top doctors. He wrote a scathing letter. You can read it on the website. It is a complete repudiation of everything that Jason Kenney has done, everything that Dr. Dina Hinshaw has done. He's calling for the immediate stopping of all testing in the province if you're asymptomatic. He's calling for the opening again of hospitals and the end of regulations on gatherings. Just a complete opposite of everything that's going on at the moment. He says the Great Barrington Declaration is where we should be. And that's the story that we've covered extensively, that declaration, Derek, is, as you know. And what they're calling for is the world to return to normal. This has been a document signed by thousands and thousands of doctors and virologists from around the world who have basically said, look, these lockdowns are not working. We're creating a bigger problem than what we have. And the interest in the column has, as you said, tremendous, hundreds of thousands of clicks just on this letter. And I think it's deepening the divide. You're either on the side of the restrictions or you're not. And I think that chasm is getting deeper. I think it was getting deeper before this letter, but I think this letter is making it a lot deeper. We tried to get through on the Kenney press conference yesterday to ask him about this, but unfortunately we weren't selected. So certainly at the Western Standard, we're going to keep trying to get the Premier's comments on it. But holy cow, guys, talking about stirring up a hornet's nest.
Indeed. We already had one person comment. TK Keslow said, how long before they start to diminish Dr. Modry's career accomplishments and attack his credibility? Well, they've already started. The hardline lockdowners have been out trying to discredit this guy. Cory, maybe you could talk a bit about some of the campaign that's already been out there to try and say, this guy is a quack, he's not credible, to try and diminish this guy's letter, rather than just being one. There are doctors who support lockdowns. There are doctors on both sides. It's an open debate, and there are a lot of doctors on both sides. It's not like one side's a fringe and one side's got it all. No side can claim to have a monopoly on expert opinion here. Why don't you tell us a bit about some of the reaction that's been trying to maybe discredit Dr. Modry, and what do you think the impact this is going to have in both Alberta and across Canada? This letter is applicable to Alberta. It's addressed to Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, but essentially Kenney is now doing mostly what other provinces are doing right now, for the most part, with a couple of small details here and there. What do you think is going to be the political so first, maybe talk about the attacks against Dr. Modry, trying to sideline this guy, discredit him, and what do you think is do you think his letter is going to have any real lasting political ramifications?
Yeah, well, most of the attacks, because his credentials are so rock solid, he's such a respected doctor, he's had so many accomplishments. Most of what we're seeing is just a social media backlash. We aren't seeing people in positions of authority daring to take a swipe at Dr. Modry, because it's just going to backfire. So there's been some tasteless stuff said about him and the usual kind of garbage on social media. But the people who are almost cult-like with the pro-lockdown, don't like apostates, and he broke ranks, and he came out as with the Barrington Declaration. He's a very credible voice. He said it in a rational, non-hysteric way. He laid out the reasons why he feels the current moves are inappropriate or perhaps ineffective and causing more damage than good. This can do a lot of damage. It's been difficult. Jason Kenney's been losing on both fronts. They say he didn't lock down enough and fast enough, and then there's people on the other side saying he's cracked down too much. And now, when we have a rational, respectable voice speaking against the lockdowns, the restrictions, and the measures, and hundreds of thousands of people are reading that, they were looking for a rational voice to come out and say this. This could have some very strong repercussions and might lead to other medical professionals coming out to break ranks as well. One of the favorite things pro-lockdown people would always try and dismiss you with on social media or one of our columns is, well, you're not a doctor, so you shouldn't even speak to it. Well, Dr. Modry is, and he's a very good one. So you're going to have to change your case.
Yeah. Ken, I don't know if your answer might be just complete no to this, but as we've said, this letter's had massive readership, primarily in the West here. Has this letter in particular started to make the rounds in the East? And if not, is there any equivalent of Dr. Modry in the East, of any kind of credible figure like this taking on, say, the Ontario or federal governments?
No and no. I don't think that people are generally aware of Dr. Modry's letter, and I don't believe there's anything comparable yet here in the East. The best source that we can look to for that is the CDC and the World Health Organization. And from the outset, CDC, I think one of their earliest statements on COVID-19, and I'm going to paraphrase slightly here, was everybody is going to get it. Most people will experience mild symptoms, and it will affect the elderly most seriously. And that has in fact been the case. There's been two, I think, major divorces from reality since the outset of COVID. And one is the magnitude of the response compared to the risk involved. If you compare that to, say, influenza, which is a similar disease, 2019, 8,500 people in Canada died from influenza alone. And I think upper respiratory illness deaths were somewhere in the magnitude of 45,000. So if you compare 8,500 influenza deaths to the deaths this year from COVID, comparing the traditional response to influenza and this global lockdown from COVID, it seems completely disproportionate and necessary. And the other part of it is masks. There was a great deal of science out there prior to this year, which showed clearly that masks are not effective in protecting from the transmission of influenza. And the definitive study was done at the University of New South Wales in 2017, I believe, which showed that cloth masks were 97% ineffective and actually increased the likelihood of infection through behavioral aspects associated with the mask, with use of the mask, and that the surgical masks, the cloth surgical masks, were 47% ineffective, so approximately twice as effective as the cloth masks. And yet our government, Theresa Tam, has recommended cloth, well, first no masks, then cloth masks, and now it's a cloth mask with a third layer. The reality is, unless you're using an N95 mask, you're not protected from COVID-19 or any other airborne transmission. And the problem here is the size of the pores in masks ranges from 80 to 500 microns, whereas the airborne aerosol particles that would affect you in a room are 2.5 microns. So a pea going through a hockey net, basically.
Thanks a lot, Ken. I think the next step of COVID is we're all going to have to wear hazmat suits outside, like we're in a nuclear fallout here. Okay, well, we're going to bring it yet closer and closer. Maybe not to you guys sitting in Vancouver and Ottawa right now, but where we are sitting in Calgary. Calgary and Edmonton city councils have extended the mandatory mask mandates for an entire year. Yes, you heard that correctly. By law, if you wear a mask virtually anywhere in Calgary and Edmonton outside of your home, and we'll see, maybe they'll start putting it in our homes soon enough, you're going to face now doubled fines. And the extension of this mandatory mask bylaws is now extended for an entire year, all the way to December 2021. Now, theoretically, they could repeal that before. They might, because there's just no way everyone's going to comply with that for a year. This stuff requires near universal compliance, and as we discussed last week, that social consensus is completely broken down for both lockdowns and masks. But Dave, you were the City Hall reporter or editor for almost 20 years at the Calgary Sun, so you have a pretty good insight into the city halls here. Why don't you tell us a bit more about this mask mandate? Who was for it, who was against it, and what they're really thinking behind it?
I think a little bit of what you're seeing, Derek, is frustration from the city that Premier Kenney hasn't done more. Alberta, if you remember, was the last province in Canada to introduce a mandatory mask bylaw or mask law, and that was only done a couple of weeks ago. Calgary and Edmonton introduced their own version of it a couple of months ago, and they've now extended it for a full year, doubling the fines, $50 to $100. I think it's probably more, so they don't have to do it every month. This virus isn't going away. Obviously, we're going to be stuck with it well into next year. So instead of having to come forward every single month and get the bylaw to go a little bit further, then they're just going to just put a blanket thing out there to cover it for an entire year. Sorry, Derek, I'm going to backtrack just a little bit because I think we missed a key thing when we were talking about what Alberta's doing with the COVID lockdown. Yesterday, Alberta became the first province in the country and one of the few places in the world to massively expand isolation centers. And what they're doing is they're going into ethnic areas in both Calgary and Edmonton that are really the hot zones in the province. And they're the hot zones through no fault of their own, as the Premier said, but because they're high density housing, they're lower income, they've got multi-generations living in the same house, and they've got multi-families living in the same house. And a lot of them in those houses don't understand English. So they haven't been able to understand what's out there for them, and they can't self-isolate it when they have symptoms. So what the province is doing is they're moving in, they're sending in people.
Dave, that's racist.
I'm sorry?
That's racist.
Yes, and Premier Kenney's got in trouble for saying that before. But the fact of the matter is, racist or not, these are where the red zone infections are. Province is being proactive, and they're sending in teams on the ground, actual workers on the ground to visit homes in the area, to give them information in their own language, to give them care packages with masks and hand sanitizers, and to tell them that if there are people in the household that need to be by themselves, come with us and we will set you up. They're setting up 1,300 rooms in the hotel rooms in the province, mainly in Calgary and Edmonton, to take these people to. When they get them into the hotel rooms, they're going to be given appropriate, culturally appropriate meals and entertainment and transportation. And when they've done their 14 days quarantine, they will get a $625 bonus, cash bonus for doing it. Premier Kenney points out that that's no different than what the province would give people who are displaced by fires or floods. But I think it's a bold step to try and do something to get the infection rate under control in these key areas.
Well, this actually does seem to make a bit more sense than these shotgun lockdown everybody, mask everybody, no matter where they are policies. This does seem to be targeted on actual hotspots where there are problems. There are linguistic and cultural barriers here. There are people who might not listen to English media constantly and getting reasonable warnings, not just the scaremongering stuff, but reasonable stuff, learning to isolate. A lot of them might not have the economic means of isolation if they are infected. So this does seem to be a bit more targeted. So I'd like to get your thoughts. Actually, we'll go to Ken. Ken, give us your thoughts maybe on this new targeted response. We are still keeping these massive shotgun approaches in Alberta and across Canada. Is there anything comparable to this in the East right now with these very large and expanded and aggressive isolation centers, particularly for minority communities?
Not that I'm aware of, not that's been publicized. I think that it's a good move. I agree with Dave. One of the problems with the shotgun approach is that the data suggests that or show that 96%, I think, of COVID fatalities in Canada and the US are in senior citizens in extended care facilities, and of that percentage, 94% have 2.6 or more comorbidities. So almost everyone who has died from COVID-19 has been a senior citizen in a retirement home of some sort, who is already sick with other illnesses. However, the approach has been to target everyone in the country. And it's important to keep in mind also that the UN doesn't support lockdown. That's on their website.
All right, thanks a lot. We're going to go to you, Cory. We're going to kind of bring it back to the the mask mandates in Calgary and Edmonton, extending them for an entire year. I don't think I try to put myself in the shoes of other people that I disagree with and try to at least understand what they're thinking. I don't think any reasonable person thinks that we should just have this for a year. I can think of only two plausible reasons. One is, as Dave already said, they don't want the political heat of having to revisit this every month or two. Every time they extend this, it's political fallout. So this is their way of saying, fine, we're going to do this once and we'll repeal it when it's done, so that they don't have to deal with the political fallout every month. The other, and these aren't mutually exclusive, the other possible reason I think for extending for a year is their way of kind of virtue signaling that we are more aggressive, we're more lockdowny than Premier Kenney. It's kind of their way of sticking it to him, saying we're even stronger than anything he's doing. Is there any other explanation you can see for this? Is it possible they actually think we should be wearing masks for a year, or is it one of these two not mutually exclusive political explanations?
Yeah, no, you covered a bit of it. I mean, there's definitely that anything you can do, we can do better from Ned Nenshi. He's been all puffed up over this. He was pushing on Kenney, saying, if Kenney doesn't come in and save Albertans, I'll stand up and do it. I'll lock Calgary down if he doesn't do it tomorrow. And then Kenney did lock Albertan down. So now it's Nenshi and his collection on council going to do? Well, they say, well, we're going to save Albertans by extending this mask law for a year. There was other things rather than just poking a stick in Kenney's eye, of course, too. I do believe a lot of them believe the masks are effective. That's fine. It's debatable where we are with it. And extending it for a year, you don't want to have to revisit it every month or even 2 months. But a year is excessive and it's lazy, and it shows that their default is actually to infringe on us and have to justify taking the infringements off later. It should be the other way around. I mean, maybe 3-month periods or something. Hey, you took on the tough job. You're going to have to get in there and rediscuss this. Too damn bad. If you don't like it, quit. I'll be more than happy if you do. But for the time being, if you're going to bring in something like that, it's your job to come in and explain why it needs to be kept. I mean, we're hearing about a vaccine. We're hearing that perhaps all Canadians who want the vaccine will be vaccinated by September. Why on earth are we extending restrictions and laws all the way to December? There's no reasoning for that. They shouldn't have to revisit this regularly, and I hope they do.
Yeah. We've got a comment from Lori Burnside. Says, how many seniors homes have any of you been in? Well, I'd say none, for very good reason, that those are the single most high-risk places to be. People my age, even all the way up to you older gentlemen, are not particularly at risk. You could die from COVID. Chances are you're not, but you can transmit it. Even if you're healthy, but you're carrying COVID and you go into a senior's home, you can infect people. And the average age of a COVID death in Alberta and most of the world is 82. The average life expectancy in Alberta, it's 81.5, and the average life expectancy in Alberta is 82. So there's a 6-month cutting short of people's lives in average here. That is bad, and we need to protect these people, but it's affecting older people. So there's good reason I haven't been in a senior's home, other than that I've got no one in a home right now. But if I was to go in a senior's home, I'd be putting people at risk. And this is one of the this is one of those restrictions that I think makes sense. We shouldn't have, this is isolating seniors, but they are genuinely at risk. So, if you got to see grandma and grandpa in the senior's home, that is unfortunately genuinely at risk. I think this is actually a good tangent. Maybe go to Dave. We had a case, I think it was in Calgary. We had a man who was knowingly infected going into a senior's home. Dave, I think it's a good tangent to go to you over. Why don't you tell us about what happened in that story?
Can you imagine anything more selfish, anything more despicable than knowing that you have COVID, knowing what they do to old folks' homes, how they spread like wildfire, knowing that you have it and going into one? This happened in Calgary last week, where a gentleman who knowingly had the disease went into an old folks' home and lied to them. Obviously all visitors are asked, and he said no, he didn't have it, didn't have any symptoms, and lied and visited his family member. Just absolutely disgusting. It's being investigated by health services, and hopefully it gets to the police, because I think criminal negligence charges should be laid. As to the viewer's question, I think the answer is no. We wouldn't be invited. We wouldn't want to go into an old folks home for their own safety. I know, fortunately, I don't have any family members who are in there. I know lots of people who do, though. And in fact, I know a person whose uncle died in one of the outbreaks at a Calgary home. I've seen the agony of people that cannot visit their relatives, that they're not allowed to visit them. They can't, just no human contact whatsoever. And it's absolutely heartbreaking. And I think what has happened to old folks' homes, not in Alberta, but across the country, is a national disgrace, an absolute disgrace. And answers need to be found so it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, it really is a tough situation. If these are communal living places, transmissions of any kind are very easy, especially for an easily communicable virus like COVID-19. And COVID-19, while it might not be particularly dangerous to me, I'm probably jinxing myself. I'm going to get I'm gonna get the Rona now, but it's not particularly dangerous to people in my age demographic, but it is extremely dangerous to older people. There's a very high fatality rate for older people, particularly if they're already have their health compromised, requiring them to be in a senior's home. But at the same time, it's leaving them devastatingly isolated. These are people who are already pretty isolated. They're very sad not to be living in their own home anymore. They're now playing bingo, half of their day, and Jeopardy. It's not. They're already feeling pretty isolated, and now they're not able to see any one of their loved ones. So it's extremely tough. But I think it is one of the few areas that is necessary. If you get a COVID outbreak in a senior's home, there's going to be a lot of deaths. Anything else to add on that or the mask mandates? Okay, we're going to take a little time, kind of go through some of the comments and questions that we have. We're not going to be able to get to every single one, unfortunately. We've got quite a few. The audience is building up quite a bit on the pipeline here. So it's getting more difficult to go through everyone. Dean Elson says the media ignores everything except what Sockboy, I'm guessing Sockboy is our prime minister, tells his masters don't want published. I think insinuating pretty strongly, I wouldn't even say insinuating, saying quite strongly that Trudeau has some kind of direct control over the media here, and that's why they're not publishing about the 570% increase in the carbon tax. Yes, there's going to be some media, probably not an insignificant number of media in Ottawa, that have they feel some kind of personal obligation to Trudeau or an ideological affinity, which is why they're not doing this. But I don't think he's necessarily making orders. I think this is self-censorship, in that this is not a good story for the Liberals. This is not something that would be popular with a lot of people, particularly in the West, but many in the East as well. I don't know. Cory, do you think this is more? Do you think there's anything to this? That this is kind of directly coming from the PMO, or do you think this is more a conspiracy of silence in the sense of they're just kind of running cover for the Prime Minister by not covering this issue?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything direct from them or anything. And I mean, it wouldn't shock me perhaps a bit in the state broadcaster and Mother Corp there, in the CBC, that they're in a bit of a different bubble of world. But for the most part, I mean, we just do have a liberal-leaning mainstream media. I mean, whether it's the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, they typically, their columnists and others just aren't going to see that as a priority on something that might not be friendly to the Prime Minister. Yeah.
The comment immediately following from Corey Shiplak says the mainstream media are paid lackeys. I think there's a lot to that. That the media now, not just the CBC, which is directly funded by the government, but now the vast majority of the mainstream media are on take and being subsidized by the federal government. I'll repeat for the 10,000th time: the Western Standard refuses to accept government subsidies. Whenever we point this out, this makes a lot of people in the competitor media that do receive the subsidies very angry. They say, no, this is just economic aid. This has nothing to do with our coverage. Ken, do you think that the media subsidies have something to do? I guess first, more broadly, does the media subsidies from the federal government impact coverage at all in the media that receive this money? And do you think it has any impact on how they're covering, or I should say not covering, this huge increase in the carbon tax?
Well, Derek, it's not supposed to, obviously, but on the other hand, the federal government is giving these media outlets money. So how likely are you to criticize someone who is paying your bills? That's really the philosophical difficulty with that practice. I don't think that it's a case of the PMO issuing orders to specific media outlets, but the other part of it too, I think, is access. So if you're a reporter looking for an interview with a minister or perhaps the prime minister, the way that you have reported on that minister may affect your chances of getting the interview. So, that's true in the United States as well. It's a question of access.
Well, that's actually a great point in general. If you're critical of politicians, you're less likely to get interviews with them. Sometimes fairly. If you're being unfairly critical of a politician, they have a right not to talk to you. When I was in politics, there were some reporters that I knew would hate me no matter what, and I just wouldn't talk to them because you're just not going to get a fair shake. But there are also, I think it's fair to say, just anyone being critical sometimes, Trudeau and the Liberals are used to very favorable coverage, and if you're critical, you're just not going to get the questions. Again, coming back to Brian Lilley's piece in The Sun about media coverage, mainstream media coverage of the carbon tax increase, Justin Trudeau took questions from a student newspaper, but wouldn't even take questions from Brian Lilley at The Sun, one of the biggest, part of Post Media, the biggest media chain in the country. Dave, you've been trying to, we're often, I consider us to be, of course I would, but I think we are fairly considered to be fair but critical news outlet of governments. We're probably the only news outlet that criticizes. Sorry, someone's got a phone going on in the background. But if at least in Alberta, we're essentially the only news that would criticize Jason Kenney and the UCP from a perspective that is not to their left. So we've been critical, at least on our opinion side, in lockdowns and whatnot. Dave, do you think this is, do you think, say, our coverage of this is a reason that someone like, Jason Kenney won't take questions from the Western Standard or be interviewed by the Western Standard while he talks to most mainstream outlets, that he's less comfortable with any criticism that would be coming from his right side?
Oh, absolutely, Derek. At the Western Standard, we don't care who we piss off as long as we, as long as we get the story right and make it accurate. But if you're an average consumer of the news and you're sitting at home and you're listening to a Jason Kenney press conference, or you're listening to a Prime Minister Trudeau press conference, just listen to who they're accepting questions from. When they're taking questions over the phone, it's not first come, first serve, and it's not random. They pick and choose who gets to ask the questions. So of course they're going to choose a CBC reporter every time. Of course they're going to choose a French CBC reporter every single time. Of course they're not going to pick Brian Lilley of the Toronto Sun or perhaps Dave Naylor of the Western Standard, because they know they may not have the answers to the questions that we're going to ask. So it's as Ken said, if all young reporters will say that they're not influenced by any of this bailout money and they just want to get the story, and obviously that's correct. The worry is the higher levels of the newsroom. There are no red phones in publisher's office to the PMO, but surely that they, once you get to a certain level within the newsroom, there must be in the back of their heads. And again, just listen to who the the politicians are accepting questions from, and I think that tells you a lot about it.
Indeed. We've got a comment from AB Free. I'm not sure, from YouTube. We're now streaming finally on YouTube. AB Free says, how can we replace Kenney with someone who will respect our liberties as soon as possible? Cory, why don't you try to bite that off?
Well, there's not much to be said. I mean, we are, as frustrating as parts of it are a democracy. Organize on the ground, work with a different party or work within that party. There's an election in a couple of years, and you have to convince enough Albertans to move them along. That's the only path rationally I see. I know some people might want to pursue things that are faster, but as far as that goes, that's the only way he's going to be replaced.
There is no effective way to replace a sitting premier or prime minister in Canada unless you have a caucus revolt. And even then, there are questions around it. The UCP constitution does not allow even a vote by the members on a leadership review if they're in government. There's only ever a vote on leadership reviews if they lose the election. Now, the guy who essentially wrote that constitution might have something, might have some kind of vested interest in a rule like that. But, I've had UCP members contact us who are upset saying, hey, can we, why don't you do something on there being a leadership review in the UCP? Well, no, it's not allowed. There is no leadership reviews in the UCP if they won the last election, and they did win the last election. So theoretically, the only way to get, if you're a UCP member and you want to keep the UCP but get rid of Jason Kenney, you have to convince a majority of the caucus to vote him out. Highly, highly, highly unlikely. It does happen, but generally it only happens when your polls start to head towards single digits and MLAs are worried about losing the election. Then you get something like what happened with Alison Redford, where the caucus says, okay, we're going to lose our seats, so you're gone. Otherwise, your only other option is to support a different party. But if you're on the right, you're obviously not going to support the NDP. So that leaves you with one of the smaller, newer parties like Wild Rose Independence, or I guess there's a whole array of small parties on that side. But there's a few of them there. But really, there's not much you can do between elections. We were promised there'd be recall, but there is no recall yet that I'm aware of. So that's that. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. I know there's a bunch of other comments here and questions, but we try to keep it short, not waste your guys' time. But make sure you tune in next week. If you're trying to comment and you'd like your comments displayed on the stream, you need to keep them short. If they're too long or you put links in them, we're just not going to put it on because it'll cover half the screen and cover our beautiful faces. And we're just not going to do that. But we thank you very much for your participation. We thank our Western Standard members for your support. Again, if you're not yet a Western Standard member, but like what we're doing, you want to support an independent, Western free press that refuses to accept government subsidies, please go to westernstandardonline.com, click on the membership section, and sign up. We very much need your support to continue doing what we're doing. Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you tuning in, your questions and comments. Cory, Dave, Ken, thank you very much for joining us, and especially Ken, I guess, who's appearing for our first time from our new bureau in Ottawa. Thank you very much for joining us, guys.
Thanks, Derek. Bye.
Welcome aboard, Ken.
Thank you.